Okay, so the evolutionary psychology behind politics. So I like to read about the subject of evolutionary psychology a lot. I consider the subject quite fascinating, and I'm going to be honest, most of the criticism I see of it is usually pretty crappy. But I did stumble across this book for free on Kindle, so I figured I would give it a shot. And what are my thoughts? Well, I gave this preamble, so it's probably not great. So, starting off, what is this book's main thesis? The main point throughout the book. I keep saying he, but the author is an anonymous conservative. Totally feels like it's written by a guy. Anyway, is that the difference between liberals and conservatives in our modern culture is maps onto what is called RK selection theory. Now, if you haven't heard of that, it's actually pretty simple. The first sentence on Wikipedia gives the basic rundown. In ecology, RK selection theory relates to the selection of combination of traits to an organism that trade off between the quality and the quantity of an offspring. Basically, this is kind of an offshoot of kind of our parental investment ideas. The extreme examples of this would be, well, you're actually in one extreme example, but a different one is that songbirds typically don't reproduce that frequently, and they tend to have two parents that invest heavily in 1 to 2 children, 1 to 3 children or offspring, right? Whereas you have a lot of species of, say, reptiles or snakes, amphibians are super common with this, some types of fish, where their main strategy for dealing with offspring is to just push out as many as possible. The sea turtle is famous for this, with the expectation that most of them will die. So that's what that RT selection theory is about. Do you invest a lot into a few offspring or a little into a large number of them? And there's an attempt to sort of graft this basic theory onto human politics. The main argument being that liberals represent R selection theory and conservatives represent K selection theory. R selection theory being the one that's common amongst snakes and reptiles, and other reptiles, that they reproduce a lot but with low investment in their children, versus the theory being that conservatives tend to be more K selected in that they tend to invest heavily into single children. How well does this book argue this hypothesis? First off, I need to get my biases out of the way initially. I know some people I've gotten some comments that disparage me as a white conservative guy. I'm not. I voted for Joe Biden before it was the only choice. That's the kind of liberal I am. Pretty center of the road liberal type. So I am a liberal, and that probably will affect my judgment of this book to a certain degree. I mean, the author literally recognizes that nobody likes to be compared to rabbits compared to wolves, which is true enough, but I think this makes some fundamentally incorrect assumptions that are mostly just based on based on other factors that the author isn't bothering to eliminate. So one of the simple factors in here that I never saw a rebuttal for is that there tends to be a difference between the sexes. So in general, women tend to be more liberal and men tend to be more conservative. Though it's interesting that 100 years ago that was the completely opposite the case, which is even more evidence that this is bullshit. But and I never see an attempt by the author to try and come up with try and diminish that as a possible as a possible explanation for why these differences come in, because there are differences between men and women, and I think somebody who's talking about the evolutionary psychology of liberals and the evolutionary psychology of politics might be somewhat aware of that fact. And that's just one example. It's a consistent issue throughout the entire book, isn't it? The author fails to examine conflating factors or ideas. Fails to deal with ideas that could be the explanation. I've often said that I think evolutionary psychology is usually right when it would be weird if it wasn't right. So, men tend to be more aggressive than women. Is that cultural? It could be, but it seems unlikely that it is, just based on the simple fact that it would be weird if it was cultural. And there's various lines of evidence that I have come to that have made me come to that conclusion, but they all seem to concord to say that no, you're in the point where you need to prove that male aggression is more created by culture than it is more created by the environment. This author doesn't do enough to convince me of the other possible explanations. And a lot of that isn't helped by the fact that the author is kind of just like reading or interpreting their evidence incorrectly. One of the evidence they gives for liberals being more prone to the R selection strategy is liberals being typically more accepting of things like abortion, which does not make any sense. I believe David Buss talked about this in, I want to say it was The Murderer Next Door, but it could have just been The Evolution of Desire. Even if I were to grant the author that, yes, an abortion counts as infanticide, when you look into the animal kingdom, what you find is that infanticide only happens in K-selected species. I mean, there's like the apathetic fish who will eat their own children, but that's not really infanticide. That's not really the same thing as infanticide, because the motivation is completely different. But you'll see but in highly K-selected animals, like zebras are a great example of this. By the way, zebras are dicks. You'll commonly see a male come into a harem, for lack of a better word, and kill the previous offspring, right? And that is simply because zebras do have that high investment into one or two offspring, not the wide investment in a lot of offspring. This anecdote that liberals are more prone to abortion is evidence that liberals are more prone to the K selection strategy, not the R selection strategy. I would also point out that, as far as I last remembered, liberals were less likely to get divorced and tended to have less children. So this is another one of those, this doesn't seem to fit the facts. You seem to be stating one thing. You seem to be saying, my theory says that liberals will be like this. And they're not actually. I will grant you that a lot of liberals seem more prone to being okay with single parent households, but that comes with a caveat that they're more okay with it because they don't have to deal with it themselves. This is what Rob Henderson has called luxury beliefs. A lot of liberals tend to be okay with single parent households because they're not the ones that ever actually have to do it, because as a rule liberals tend to be more educated people tend to be less prone to getting divorces. So I think that's the overall problem with the focus on single parent households that the author fails to recognize. It's that yes, liberals need to shut up and say that no, a two-parent household is very important for children. But they need to stop saying, but it's more or less that they need to stop saying that not because they're actually dealing with it, but because it's having an outside effect on, frankly, people who are more likely to be conservative. This leads into yet another problem with this, is that this is a very in this moment and this place book. This is very focused on particularly American liberals and American conservatives. there's like an entire chapter given on the book about why liberals tend to be more prone to accepting people from abroad, and influence from different areas of the world, which I need to point out is not a universal thing between the left-right divide. A simple hop across the border to Canada will show you that. I believe J.J. McCullough has constantly pointed this out, that a lot of Canadian nationalism, a lot of Canadians' exceptionalism is very much about not being American, and that not being American element has a real kind of xenophobic slant to it, specifically towards Americans. And this tends to come from the Liberal Party of Canada, not the Conservative Party. The Conservative Party of Canada tends to be more okay with American influence, free trade between the United States and Canada, whereas the Liberal Party tends to be more so. So he has an entire chapter explaining something that is pretty particular to the United States. And I wouldn't even say the United States. I would say a particular perception of the United States that failed to hold in 2016. Back in 2010, liberals were more in favor of, being allied and okay with Russia. By 2016, that flipped to conservatives having a more favorable opinion of Russia. Your entire biological explanation doesn't even make sense. What this seems to be mostly is just that people are signaling their allegiance to certain things. Conservatives are more okay with Russia because Trump said he was okay with Russia, and, I'm following the party line. And to be clear here, a lot of the times people do just follow the party line because they're fucking busy. You got other shit going on, and I don't begrudge people who don't get into the nitty-gritty details of every specific policy decision. I barely do that. I don't do that enough, honestly. So, yeah, overall, I think the author is unaware of alternative hypotheses, sometimes provides a lot of contradictory evidence without seeming to realize it, and is very American-centric. I don't think this does a good job of explaining the differences between liberals and conservatives. It's a basic rundown of KR theory selection with a very conspiratorial coat of paint to it. Is there anything to be gained from reading this book? I would say that if you're well versed in evolutionary psychology, this book is a wonderful example of how not to do it. And that is, find one particular theory that's explaining things simply, succinctly, and incorrectly. So yeah, that's kind of my thoughts on this book. Perhaps I am just a cucked libtard SJW, despite the fact that I hate social justice warriors, but I remain unconvinced about the underlying theory. It seems like he's just sort of, he saw a superficial resemblance to something and is just sort of making it fit.